The Earth is unique. As far as we know, it is the only planet in the universe to have life, and it is our home. But our actions are killing it. We are in a planetary emergency comprised of several overlapping crises: the climate crisis, the ecological crisis, and the health and pollution crisis. All of these are to do with our overconsumption of the Earth's resources and how we interact with and treat our home. This presentation will focus on one of those crises, arguably the most important, the climate emergency. We will discuss what it is and why it is important to take action. I think by now everyone has heard about climate change, but it is not always clear what it is or what it means. So it is important to start with the difference between weather and the climate. The day-to-day changes we see is the weather: rain, fog, snow, sunshine, and wind. All of these are weather, whilst the climate is the long-term trend of weather patterns for a particular area, such as Bristol, the United Kingdom, Europe, or the world. The best way to think of the difference is to imagine the weather as our mood, and just like our mood, the weather is highly changeable. It can change weekly, daily, hourly, or in the UK, by the minute. And like our personality, which is our mood averaged over a long period, the climate is the weather averaged over a long period for a specific area. So why is this important? Because our climate is changing, and changing drastically. The clearest sign that our climate is changing is that it is getting hotter. This is what is referred to as global warming. Our planet is heating up. You can see from this graph, which shows the temperature variation over the last 2,000 years relative to the 20th century, that we are getting hotter, a lot hotter. In fact, the planet has already warmed by roughly 1.1 to 1.2 degrees since 1850, and we keep breaking temperature records. The summer of 2021 was the hottest summer ever, whilst 2020 was the hottest year on record. In fact, all 10 of the hottest years have occurred since the turn of the century, and 9 of the 10 hottest years since 2010. But why is the climate changing? Unfortunately, the answer is clear. It's us. All of it is because of us. It's changing because of the greenhouse effect. The following video explains what the greenhouse effect is.
What is the greenhouse effect? Earth is a comfortable place for living things. It's just the right temperature.
So these greenhouse gases come from lots of different sectors, such as transportation, manufacturing, building, electricity generation, and food production. The sections with the flame represent the burning of fossil fuels, such as which release carbon dioxide. Fossil fuels such as oil, coal, and gas are formed by natural processes over millions of years, such as the decomposition of plants and other organisms, which are then buried under layers of rock and form carbon-rich deposits of fossil fuels. We have then dug up these fossil fuels and burnt them. Whilst the main issue with agriculture are the release of methane and carbon dioxide, the biggest source of methane is animals. More specifically, animals with multiple stomachs such as cows, sheep and goats, which burp it out, whereas the main source of carbon dioxide from agriculture is from the clearance of forests, which collect and store carbon. Fossil fuels are everywhere. We burn them to power our cars, planes, to cook our food with and to heat our homes, and for electricity. All these activities release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. But how do we know it's all because of us? Well, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the UN's body for assessing the science of climate change, stated in a report last year that the human cause of climate change is unequivocal. This graph, taken from that IPCC report, shows that virtually all warming is because of us. The black line is the observed warming since 1850, whilst the green line shows the change in temperature if humans hadn't emitted any greenhouse gas emissions and only natural factors such as volcanoes and the sun were affecting the global temperature. You can see that the temperature wouldn't have changed much at all, whilst the brown line, which is the simulated warming from both human emissions and natural forcings, e.g. the solar and volcanic, and this follows the observed warming almost perfectly, showing that climate change is down to us. So why should we care? We should care because climate change threatens the lives and livelihoods of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people, as well as the lives of countless species and their homes. Climate change is no longer something that will happen in the distant future, but something we are all living through now, and it will affect every single one of us in some way. This year alone, we have seen massive wildfires in Greece and Italy, California, Siberia, and Turkey, as well as Canada and the US seeing record-breaking heat, whilst floods ravaged China, New York, Germany, and Sicily. And it's not just happening far away. In the UK, we've seen flooding in London and the first extreme heat warning, whilst trains to the climate conference that took place in Glasgow last year were cancelled because of flooding. And this is just the beginning. Unfortunately, things are going to get worse. As long as we keep pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, the temperature will continue to increase. It's not just about what we emit today, but what we have released over the last few hundred years. It all adds up. Over half of emissions released since 1751 have been released in the last 30 years, since 1991. In climate science, this is what's known as a carbon budget. Like a money budget, a carbon budget shows the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that we can release until a certain temperature threshold is reached. In this case, 1.5 degrees. The temperature objective agreed to in the Paris Agreement, which all countries signed up to. You can see from the bucket on the bottom right that we are dangerously close to filling up all that budget. In fact, we have 10 years of current emissions until we overflow the bucket, and the longer we wait, the faster we have to act. So one thing that is worth noting is that even if we get emissions down to zero, if we stop filling up the bucket, we currently have no way of emptying it. The bucket is going to remain full, with global temperatures remaining high for centuries to come. So if we had started to reduce emissions in 1990, when the first IPCC report was published detailing the science of climate change, then we would have had over 100 years to get emissions down to zero, and would have only had to reduce emissions by a few percent a year, as shown by the green dotted line. But because emissions have continued to increase, as you can see by the black line, we now need to rapidly and urgently reduce our emissions to zero. This can be seen by the red line, which goes to zero by 2040. This is going to cause significant disruption, but far less disruption than if we continue to let temperatures increase. It's fair to say that this decade is probably the most important decade in human history, and this is why everyone is starting to talk more about climate change. So why 1.5 degrees? Temperature targets have a long and complex history, and are more to do with politics than science. But one of the main reasons everyone is talking about 1.5 degrees is because of small island states. These small island and low-lying coastal countries, some of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change, such as Tonga, the Maldives and the Marshall Islands, have been fighting for years to get the global community to set a target of 1.5 degrees, because temperature rise above that would mean disaster, with many of these countries likely to literally be wiped off the map by rising sea levels. But it is not just these countries that more than 1.5 degrees of temperature rise would be a disaster for. In 2018, the IPCC released a report on 1.5 degrees of warming. In it, they show the difference between different levels of warming and what they mean. For example, at 1.5 degrees, there will be up to 1.1 months of heat waves, which could cause death, compared to 1.5 months for 2 degrees. At 1.5 degrees, many crop yields will decrease, such as wheat, by 9%, but at 2 degrees, it will decrease by 16%. By 2100, at 1.5 degrees, the sea level will rise by 40 centimetres, but will rise by 50 centimetres at 2 degrees. Now this doesn't seem like a lot, 10 centimetres, but that 10 centimetres could mean the difference between being flooded or not for many, many people. So these maps show the floods risk for London and the Bristol Channel, including Cardiff. The red areas represent the areas that will flood annually by 2050. So furthermore, at 1.5 degrees, coral reefs are projected to decline by between 90%, a disaster, but they will still survive in small pockets. But at 2 degrees, coral reefs will decline by 98%, making them essentially extinct. There are also huge unknowns when it comes to climate change. We are undertaking a massive experiment that we simply do not know what the outcome will be. For example, several tipping points have been identified, and we simply don't know when we will pass the point of no return. Tipping points are thresholds where a tiny change can push a system into a completely new state. Rather than changing gradually, when a tipping point is crossed, it can result in a rapid, irreversible change. Imagine it like a Jenga tower. The more we warm the Earth, the more bricks we are removing from the tower, making it less stable. A climate tipping point is like when you pull out a brick which causes the tower to fall. As soon as you remove that brick, the collapse is then too late to stop and the tower topples. Now this Jenga tower can be many different things. It could be ice sheets in Greenland, the monsoon rains in Asia, the Gulf Stream, and many, many more. But what is different is that once that key brick is removed from the Jenga tower, it collapses instantly, whereas these systems will collapse over decades or centuries. But the key thing is that once that tipping point is crossed, preventing it from collapsing is impossible. And what is scary is that we cannot say with confidence when we may pass these tipping points. Take the example of the Amazon rainforest, the largest forest in the world, which could become a grassland like the savanna in Africa. This could happen because of reduced amount of rainfall due to climate change, or, since the Amazon produces half of its own rainfall, by cutting down too many trees it could reduce the amount of rainfall. If rainfall falls to a certain amount, this could lead to more trees dying, which could lead to less rain and more trees dying. You could see how the cycle would work until there are no trees left. A system that is a bit more relevant to us is the Gulf Stream. which brings warm water from the tropics to Europe and means we have a relatively warm climate. So far, the Gulf Stream has slowed by about 15% and will likely slow further because of climate change, and could even stop altogether. This would result in Western Europe and the UK being significantly colder, think more like Canada, but arguably, more importantly, it would reduce rainfall a lot. Much of the UK would be too dry to grow any food at all. At the moment, the science says that we are unlikely to cross this tipping point until temperature rise by 3 degrees or more, but other tipping points could push us to that level and cause an almost domino effect. We simply do not know how these will work. So we've been talking about 1.5 degrees a lot, but the current policies governments have enacted put us on track for 2 degrees, 2.7 degrees of warming, and it is important to remember who is going to be most impacted by our failure to act. Now, all of us will feel the effects of climate change, but it is those born most recently and those born in the future that will be impacted the most. We are destroying their future. You can see from this graph that those born in 2020 are significantly more likely to experience extreme heat waves. But the likelihood that they will experience these heat waves depends on what we do now to reduce emissions, as limiting warming to 1.5 degrees compared to 2.7 would almost halve the exposure risk to heat waves from 30% to less than 20. 1.5 degrees is slowly slipping out of reach though, but we still have time to choose which future we would like. If we are willing to act and act now, we need to remember that every 0.1 degree of warming we prevent will result in significantly less suffering for our children and all future generations. So what can we do to stop climate change? Luckily, we know exactly what needs to be done. We need to reduce emissions to net zero and temperatures will stabilise, and we have the technologies to do it. We need to leave fossil fuels like oil, coal and gas in the ground and ensure that we only get electricity from renewable sources such as wind power and solar. We need to make the way we travel more sustainable. We need to move away from petrol and diesel cars to electric cars and greener public transport. And more importantly, we need to shift to more active forms of travelling, such as cycling and walking. This will help not only tackle climate change, but air pollution and make us healthier as well. We need to make our homes more energy efficient, replacing single glazed windows with double glazing and by adding insulation. We need to change how we heat our homes, shifting from gas boilers to electric options such as heat pumps. And we need to replace our gas stoves with electric hobs. And finally, we need to change our food system, which is responsible for roughly a quarter of all our emissions, even more if you include the emissions related to packaging, transportation and storage of food. There are lots of different things we need to do to reduce our emissions from food, but the thing which will have the biggest impact is a shift to a more plant-rich diet. Now that does not mean eliminating meat and dairy completely. We definitely do not all need to go vegan, but we do need to reduce how much meat we eat. This is because animal products, and more specifically beef and lamb, have significantly higher environmental impacts than plant-based foods, whether it is water use, land use or greenhouse gas emissions. Meat and dairy is worse for the planet. So you can see from this graph that animal-derived foods have much higher emissions per kilogram than plant-based foods. Beef, lamb, cheese have the highest impact, whilst fruit and veg, beans and nuts are near the bottom with the lowest impact. However, reducing meat consumption on its own is not enough. In order to ensure that the food we eat isn't hurting the planet, we also need to increase yields, not overconsume food, improve farming practices and reduce food waste. Globally, around 1/3 of all food is wasted, and this is responsible for 6% of all global emissions. If it was a country, food waste would be the third largest emitter after China and the United States. In the UK, we waste an average of 68 kilograms of food per person a year, with products such as bread, milk and potatoes the most commonly wasted food items. And reducing food waste would not only reduce our emissions, but would also save us a lot of money, with wasted food costing the average home £730 per year. So what can we do? So we all live busy lives, and making big change can seem scary, but there are a few things we can all do which are relatively easy. If you own your own home, then try and shift to an energy provider which supplies 100% renewable energy, such as Bulb, Ecotricity or Octopus. Many of you won't be able to completely give up the use of your car, but you can significantly reduce how much you use it. Many of the trips we take in our cars we could easily walk or cycle, which would reduce air pollution, improve our health and reduce emissions. Flying is often the single biggest contributor to someone's individual emissions, so choosing to holiday in the UK can have a big positive impact. Flying to America and back would emit close to 1,000 kilograms of CO2, equivalent to driving 6,000 miles in a standard car. But that doesn't mean you should never fly, but flying less will make a big difference. We can also eat less red meat and dairy. Beef and lamb are incredibly damaging for the planet, so reducing the amount you eat will reduce your emissions. Again, you do not have to eliminate red meat completely, but reducing the amount you eat is important. This will also have significant health benefits, as overconsumption of red meat is a major contributor to health issues. Why not try replacing red meat with other, lower impact meats such as chicken or pork, or have a meat-free meal a week? You'll be surprised what you can make without meat. New items, whether clothes, electrical devices or cars, require a lot of energy to produce. So by buying second-hand, you reduce the demand for energy to produce these items. Where possible, buy second-hand. Facebook Marketplace is brilliant for loads of things, whilst apps such as Depop and Vinted have a brilliant selection of second-hand clothes. It is also possible to buy lots of devices such as phones and laptops, which have been refurbished and tend to be a lot cheaper. And where possible, try and repair items rather than binning them. So next, you can be greener with your money. Many banks and pension funds continue to invest huge amounts of money into fossil fuels. By divesting your money from the big name banks, you can send a big message that you do not want your money contributing to climate change. And finally, get informed. Learn about the climate crisis and, more importantly, talk to people about it. Friends, family, even strangers. Talk to anyone who will listen. An entertaining way to understand more about all of this is a BBC show called Shop Well for the Planet. As individuals, we cannot save the world on our own, but by acting together, we can push for wider change. There is a great quote which sums this up. We don't need a handful of people doing sustainable living perfectly. We need millions of people doing it imperfectly. The picture is bleak, but there is still time to prevent the worst case scenario. What we need is to act now. I will leave you with a quote from the Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg. Of course we need hope, but the one thing we need more than hope is action, because once we start to act, hope is everywhere.